Okay, it's my pleasure to introduce David Keating, who's going to talk to us about Aztec diamond tilings. And I still think more people are going to show up, but we'll just from here.
All right, so should we, we're gonna start now?
Sure.
Okay, so thanks for having me. Like he said, we're gonna talk about K tilings of the Aztec diamond. So a little outline of our plan. We're gonna first review just the standard tilings of, this will probably be familiar to a lot of people in the audience, but it'll be useful for us to go through it. So we'll focus on the relationship with the tilings and interlacing partitions, as well as a relationship with a certain like 5 vertex model. So then we're going to generalize the 5 vertex model to K coupled copies of the 5 vertex model. And this is a vertex model related to like Coinversion LLT polynomials. And from the coupled vertex models, we'll get back a coupled tiling, K tiling of the Aztec diamond. And we'll then prove some combinatorial results in certain limits of the coupling parameter. So that's our plan. And this is joint work with Sylvie Corteil and Andrew Gitlin. Okay, so let's start with the Aztec diamond. So the Aztec diamond was first introduced by Elkies, Cooperberger, Larson, and Propp in 1992. So here is an example of the Aztec diamond of rank 3. So it's a checkerboard region of the plane. And here we cover it with dominoes. So each domino covers 2 adjacent faces of the checkerboard. We can add weight to these dominoes. So we're going to add weights to vertical dominoes, where we first, let's label the slices, the diagonal slices of our checkerboard from 0 to 6 in the case of rank 3, but 0 to 2m in the case of rank m. And we'll assign a domino a weight of xi if it's vertical, with the white face being in slice 2i minus 1. So for example, these 2 vertical dominoes have the top face being in slice 1. So that's 2 times 1 minus 1. So they get an x1 each, and we get an x1 squared. And we'll assign yi's to the other type of vertical domino, where the top square is a black face. And if the bottom slice is on the bottom square is on slice 2i minus 1, we're going to get a weight of yi. So we have no y1s, but up here we have 2 vertical dominoes where the bottom slice is, or the bottom square is on slice 3, and these are going to give us a 2 y2s, so we get a y2 squared. And all other dominoes have weight 1. So the partition function for this model can be computed, and you get this nice product formula, where it's a product over I less than or equal to j of 1 plus xi yj. And in particular, if you set xi and yi equal to 1, so if you set all your weights equal to 1, we just count the total number of tilings, and we get that the total number of tilings is 2 to the m plus 1 choose 2. So in a bit, we'll sketch a vertex model proof of this theorem. That'll be useful for us for the K tilings. All right, but before we get to that, I want to give a bijection between these tilings and sequences of interlacing partitions. So we're going to assign particles and holes to our dominoes, so to the faces of our checkerboard, according to these rules. So this vertical domino and this horizontal domino get particles, and the other 2 dominoes get holes. So in my pictures, I'm usually just going to draw the particles, and I'll leave the holes blank. So now, along every slice, we're going to think of it as having a string of particles. And this string of particles, we're going to think of as being the Maya diagram of some partition. So to remind you about what the Maya diagram of a partition is you take a partition, say 4, 3, 2, 2, 1, drawn here in French notation. And on every vertical step in our drawing of the partition, we're going to assign a hole or assign a particle. And every horizontal step, we're going to assign a hole. And then we're going to just read the particles and holes from top to bottom. So in this case, it goes particle, particle, then you see hole, particle, particle, and so on. So you can think of this as an infinite sequence where to the left, we have infinitely many particles, and to the right, we're going to have infinitely many holes. And so this other example here, we have the empty partition. And in this case, we just have packed to the left particles and packed to the right holes. So since these are like infinite sequences of particles and holes, there's a little bit of ambiguity of what you call the center. So I'm always going to mark the 0 content line of our partition with this like red line. So if we look back at our domino tiling, you should think of this as having infinitely many particles kind of off our diagram to the bottom left and infinitely many holes off our diagram to the top right. And I've kind of labeled the 0 content line as this red slice. So now to every string of these particles, you can associate some partition. So we'll want to be able to describe relationships between our partitions. So we say that two partitions interlace if this string of inequalities holds. So lambda1 is bigger than mu1 is bigger than lambda2 is bigger than mu2. So in this case, we have 3 is bigger than 2 is bigger or greater than or equal to. 3 is greater than or equal to 2 is greater than or equal to 2 is greater than or equal to 2 is greater than or equal to 2. And I have drawn, so mu here, 2, 2 in gray, and lambda, we've added on these extra cells. So if you're familiar with the terminology, this is, you could say that these differ by adding a horizontal strip. If you add a horizontal strip to mu, you get the partition lambda. But if you're not familiar with the terminology, this is just the inequality, the string of inequalities. And we say they co-interlace if the conjugate partitions interlace. So if we take this picture and we just transpose it, so flip it along its main diagonal, that gives us the conjugate partitions. And since conjugating this gives us this diagram, the conjugate partitions interlace. So we say the partitions in the picture at the bottom co-interlace. So now to these examples of tilings, we can associate a sequence of interlacing partitions. And it turns out, one can show this, that the way the interlacing works out is you start with the empty partition. You'll always start with the empty partition. Then you'll grow your partition such that these co-interlace. And then you'll shrink your partition such that 1 and 2 interlace. And then you repeat this until you get to the final slice, which is forced to be the empty partition again. So the example on the left here is all the partitions being empty, since we always have particles just packed to the left at the 0 content line. And for the example on the right, you can sort of read off how far each particle had to jump from the empty partition to read off your partitions in this sequence. So if you look at slice 1, for example, the front particle had to jump once to go from being here to being there. And the second particle also had to jump once to go from being here to being here. So the partition is 1, 1. So you can sort of read off from the particles the partitions and from the partitions to the particles. So there's a bijection from these interlacing sequences and domino tilings. So this will be important for us. Is there any questions about how this works? I'm sure most people have probably seen it. Okay. And now in terms of the partitions, we can still read off the weights. So the X's are going to be associated to whenever we see a co-interlacing, and the Y's are associated to whenever we see an interlacing. And so you look at the first co-interlacing, and you look at the difference in size of the partitions. So this is a partition of the size 2, and this is a partition of size 0. So we get 2 minus 0 is equal to 2, and we see that gives us x1 squared. And the same thing, you look at, say, the first interlacing, and these have the same size, so the difference is 0, so we have no y1s. And so from the partitions, you can read off the weight. All right. So now we want to give a vertex model formulation for this. So we're going to have a bijection between sequences of partitions and path configurations on a vertex model that looks like this. So the colors here on the faces of this lattice are just going to represent, so the purple row will have different weights than the gray row. And we'll assign partitions to the horizontal slices in between the rows. So where the paths cross the horizontal slices, we'll think of there being particles there, and we'll associate this to a partition. And because of our particular choice of weights, the partitions will have to satisfy some particular interlacing conditions, which will be the same as the Aztec diamond. So we'll end up getting weight preserving bijection between path configurations on this and tilings of the Aztec diamond. So that's our goal for this next little bit of the talk. So we're going to need 2 different vertex models. So the purple here is exactly the purple I showed on those rows in the previous slide. So the weights for this are, it's a 5 vertex model. So locally in any face, there's only 5 allowed configurations. And you get an X whenever a path exits to the right. So here's an example row. So the paths start here at the bottom and exit here at the top. And notice once I fix the boundary conditions of a row, the path configuration is completely determined. So the boundary conditions completely determine the paths for a single row. So we can assign a partition to the boundary conditions by just marking somewhere to be like the 0 content line. In this case, I'm marking it with a little x. And then thinking of these particles as being the Maya diagram for a partition. And anywhere there's not a particle, there's a hole. So this on the bottom here is a partition 2, 0, 0, because this particle has jumped 2 from being packed in at the left. And then on the top, we have 3, 1, 1, because this particle's jumped 3, and then each of these has jumped 1. And so notice the weight here is exactly x to the size of lambda minus the size of mu, which is exactly the weight we associated to co-interlacing partitions in our sequence. And in particular, for the purple rows, you can check that the weight is only non-zero if lambda and mu co-interlace. Okay, so then we also have this white set of weights, the white faces. So this is not the gray faces that we'll need, but it's related. So these are another 5 vertex model, where now the weights are still an x when the path exits right. But in this, for these weights, we allow a horizontal step where the path just goes straight along horizontal, but not across. Right? So they're a different 5 vertex model. And we can assign partitions to the boundary conditions for a row in the same way as before. But now these weights force that the row will only have non-zero weight if lambda and mu interlace. Okay. But this is not quite what we want, because here mu, or like lambda, is bigger than mu. We have to grow mu to get to lambda. And what we'd like is to be able to have the bigger partition on the bottom, so that we're shrinking the partition as we go up our lattice. But before we get to that, just a short aside, that these white faces you can think of as being a vertex model for Schur polynomials. So if I stack a bunch of white rows, start paths at mu at the bottom and end the paths at lambda at the top, then there's just an easy bijection between semi-standard Young tableau of this shape lambda skew mu and these path configurations, where say if you look at this top row where it's 4, 4, that means this leftmost path just goes up to the 4th row, then goes over twice. So it picks up 2 x4s, just like you would get the weight for the semi-standard Young tableau. Right. So just as an aside, this is a vertex model for sure polynomials. And we'll kind of reference this fact again later. But okay, what we really care about are these gray faces. So this is just a change of variables from the white faces. So instead of getting x when the path exits right, it now gets 1 over x, and then we multiply everything by x. So that turns this into getting the weight of 1 when a path exits right, and a weight of x everywhere else. So now there's a little bit of technical details here. We still want to assign partitions as the boundary conditions for the row. But now when we talk about a gray row, we're going to always force that one of the paths exits to the right at the end of the row. And we're going to shift the content line, 0 content line over 1 in the top. So now on the bottom here, we have 3, 1, 1, because this particle had to jump 3. And each of these particles start like 1 over from where they were fully packed. And the top, we have 1, 1, 0, because there is no third particle. And then these two have jumped over 1. So with this choice of labeling, of indexing the boundary conditions by partitions, you force that mu and lambda still interlace, but now mu is always going to be the bigger one. So this kind of shrinks the partition as we move up the lattice. And if you look at the weight for a single row, we'll get x's whenever a path exits to the top. And notice that every path exits to the top except 1. So we get some weight that's just a function, like some power of x, that's just the number of paths minus 1. And then we get the weight we care about, which is the difference in size of the partitions. So that's coming from these empty faces. So this number of paths term will kind of be, it'll just be fixed by the configuration and won't, or by the like number of paths. It won't really depend on the configuration. So eventually we're just going to ignore it. But it does show up for a single row. Okay. So now we have a bijection. The point of all this is we have a bijection between paths on this and tilings of the Aztec diamond by going through these sequences of interlacing partitions. So for example, in this one we did before, where we had 1, 1, 1, 1, 2, 1, 1, 2. So we start with the empty partition on the bottom. It goes up to 1, 1. So the first 2 dots jump over 1. And now it goes, or it stays at 1, 1. But on a gray row, that's kind of like the 0 content line shifts over. So you just have to like figure out where to put the dots. And then a purple row to 2, 1. And then to the partition 1, then the partition 2. So, and then empty at the top. So to each horizontal slice, we can assign dots according to what partitions we want to be there. And yeah, and then these particles like uniquely determine the path configuration, because in each row, the boundary conditions uniquely determine the path configuration. And then if you work out the weight, we'll have the same weight as the tiling times a term that's just depending on the number of paths. So this is the terms from the gray rows that solely depend on the number of paths. So these are just some fixed factor that doesn't depend on the configuration, only on the rank. So ignoring this factor, this is like a weight preserving bijection between tilings and the vertex model. Okay, so why we want to do this is that in terms of the vertex model, it's actually very easy to compute the partition function because we can just use the Yang-Baxter equation. So it turns out that these weights satisfy a Yang-Baxter equation in that you can swap gray and purple by like intertwining them with this other vertex model, which I've drawn in yellow, whose weights are as follows. So the important bit for us here is the empty weight, which is just 1. And when the path goes diagonally from the top left to the bottom right, where you get a 1 over 1 plus xy. So if we want to compute the partition function, we can start with this lattice where all the grays are on the bottom and all the purples are at the top. Here, the partition function for this is like trivial to compute because it's completely frozen. The paths have to just exit on the side here. So this first path has to just go right immediately and exit at the side. And the second path gets to go up and exit at the side. So there's only one configuration of this. So the weight of this is simple. But now we can use the Yang-Baxter equation to swap purple and gray rows. And every time we do this at the end, we'll find a yellow face where the path is going down and right. So we'll get rid of that and just leave its weight. And this will be a factor of like 1 plus xy inverse. And now if we multiply all these factors back onto the other side, we get that the partition function of the lattice we actually care about is a partition function of all the grays on the bottom and all the purples on top times our the product of I less than or equal to j 1 plus xy yj. And then the partition function of this all grays on bottom, all purples on top lattice is just some fixed factor, which is exactly this fixed factor that's just determined by the rank, like the number of paths. So ignoring this factor, we get that the Aztec diamond partition function is the product of I less than or equal to j of 1 plus xi yj. So from the like vertex model formalism, the Yang-Baxter equation allows us to compute the partition function in like a somewhat simple way. So any questions about this before we move on?
I had a question. So I've seen like a very similar sort of combined model. Like, so I think the purple rows, if I'm right, are also give Schur polynomials, right? They're kind of dual by this particle hole duality.
That's right. Yeah.
And then is the Cauchy identity like I think
so this is
if you do the Yang-Baxter equation the whole way, do you get the Cauchy identity for Schur polynomials?
Yeah, you can prove the Cauchy identity by this, like basically the exact same argument.
So you've got something kind of intermediate between the two sides of the Cauchy identity.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. So if we continued to push all the grays to the top, we would have gotten like what amounts to the Cauchy identity.
Isn't it the dual Cauchy identity though?
Yeah. So the purple here will give me like the conjugate Schur polynomial, probably. I'm pretty sure that's right.
Yeah, I mean, because it looks like what happened, like this 1 over x business, because you can kind of renormalize the Cauchy identity to look like x plus y. And then you have to, you're multiplying by this overall kind of rectangular block of the, in this case, the x variables. And yeah, you do this 1 over x substitution as well.
Right. Any other questions? Okay, so just to summarize what's happened so far, we have a bijection between tilings of the Aztec diamond and sequences of interrelation partitions. And we also have a bijection between sequences of partitions and a certain vertex model. And then from the vertex model formalism, it's simple to compute the partition function because we have the Yang-Baxter equation. So now what we're going to do is we're going to generalize the vertex model. And we'll end up with a vertex model that's like k interacting copies of the 5 vertex models we just discussed. And then from these, we'll still have a Yang-Baxter equation. So we'll still be able to compute the partition function, like basically exactly how we did before, except more complicated weights. And then from the K coupled 5 vertex models, using the same bijection, we'll get K coupled Aztec diamond tilings. So we went through the trouble of getting to the vertex model because that's what I'm actually going to generalize it first. Okay, so this vertex model is related to LLT polynomials. So I'm going to talk about that briefly. So I'm going to call it the LLT vertex model. Okay. So just some background on like LLT polynomials. So they were first introduced by Lescaut, Leclerc, and Thibon, who they are named after. And they were studying semi-standard ribbon tableau. And they were counting a certain statistic on ribbon tableau called spin. But then later, Hagelin, Heyman, and Lur showed that there was an equivalent formulation in terms of tuples of semi-standard Young tableau, where you counted a statistic known as coinversions. So we are gonna talk about these coinversion LLT polynomials. That's what we're kind of interested in here. And our vertex model is a vertex model for these polynomials, which was some work done by myself and collaborators recently. But just to point out, there's also a vertex model for the spin LLT polynomials. And you can show that, well, you can show that these two polynomials are the same up to some changes in like this coupling parameter. So I'm going to call it T. So with some changes in like the change of variable in T, these are actually the same polynomials. Okay, and another thing to note is that the vertex model I'm going to describe is actually a degeneration of a much more like general vertex model by Agarwal, Borden, and Wheeler. And they were studying the quantum group UQ-SL2K hat. So in particular, when I say we have the Yang-Baxter equation, the way I actually would show this, I would take their vertex model where they know they have the Yang-Baxter equation, I degenerate it to the weights I have. So this is really a degeneration of some more powerful vertex model. Okay. And now I'm going to go into some detail on the weights. But if you like get bogged down, the moral of this little section of the talk is that we have a Yang-Baxter integral vertex model. It happens to be related to LLT polynomials. It can be viewed as K interacting copies of what we did previously. And we can just map these to K copies of domino tilings that are also interacting. So if you get kind of bogged down in all the weights, the reason we're doing all this is just because the Yang-Baxter equation makes it easy for us to compute the partition function at the end. So eventually we'll just say what the weights are in terms of the tilings and we'll forget about the vertex model. All right. So that's our next intermediate goal. Okay, so let's define the LLT polynomials. So you're going to look at tuples of skew shapes. So lambda1 skew mu1 up to lambda k skew mu k. And then you're going to consider the polynomial where you get x to the fillings. So, you know, for this, you'd get an x2 squared times x1. And for here, you get an x3 squared times x1 squared. So you get an x weight that just corresponds to the filling. And then we're going to have a t to the number of coinversions, where coinversions measure the number of triples of this form. So we're going to draw all our skew diagrams. In this case, neither of them are skew, but that's okay, along content lines. So they're aligned along content lines. And then we're going to look for triples where x is less than or equal to y, less than or equal to z, where x and z are in the same shape and they're next to each other, and y is in a lower shape, so an earlier shape in the tuple, and along the same content line as z. So for example, here we have x is 1 is less than or equal to y is less than or equal to z. So we have 1 less than or equal to 1 less than or equal to 2. So this gives us one coinversion triple. And we also allow that x and z don't have to be in the diagram. And if they're not in the diagram, we make them 0 and infinity respectively. So for example, we have 2 less than or equal to 3 less than or equal to infinity is another coinversion triple. And then finally, there'd be one more here, which I think is, 0 less than or equal to 1 less than or equal to 1. So this configuration or this like filling would get a weight of t cubed because there are 3 coinversions. Okay. So let's do some special cases. So when k is equal to 1, so we just have one skew shape, then there can't be any coinversions. So we get no t's, and in fact, we just get the Schur polynomial of that shape. And we know a vertex model for Schur polynomials. It's these white weights I described earlier. When t is equal to 1, then each of the shapes is kind of not interacting with any of the other shapes. So we just get a product of Schur polynomials. And since we know a vertex model for each of these Schur polynomials, we could think, well, why don't we just draw those in different colors and then overlay them? And now we get some, say, k-colored vertex model, where at a face, we just look at the product of the weights for each color. So now the hope is that when we set t not equal to 1, that the coinversion actually maps to kind of a nice local weight in this like combined vertex model. And it turns out that that is the case. So if you look at, if you just follow through with this bijection between semi-standard fillings and paths, you could see that if you get a triple like this, in this case, say x is less than y is less than z strict, then in the lower shape, I'm going to color it blue, the y means in row y, the blue path exits right. And then here, the xz means at same column, the red path exits at z, but it entered at x. So this would give us one coinversion, and we can assign that coinversion to this face by saying that, well, whenever the smaller color exits right and a larger color is present, we're going to give a weight of t. And it turns out this maps, this is the correct mapping. So here's the weights in more detail. So you should think of them as just for each color. So now we have k colors. We take the product of the weights of each color at a face, except instead of x, when a smaller color exits right, it's going to get x times t to the number of larger colors that are present. So it's just a product of one color weights, except they interact in some way. For example, when you have 2 colors, and if blue is the smaller color, these are all the faces that can contribute a t, because the blue has to exit right and the red has to be present. So in this example we had before, if you draw the corresponding paths and say t1 is blue and t2 is red, then our 3 coinversions are actually these 3 faces, where blue is exiting right and red is present. Okay. So it's a theorem that, you know, the partition function of these like stacks of white rows, where now on the boundaries, you're not assigning one partition, but you're assigning like a tuple of partitions, one for each color. This is exactly the Coinversion LLT polynomial. But of course, what we'd like, so that was a generalization of the like white weights, the white faces. We want a generalization of the gray faces. So before, we would plug in 1 over x into the white weights and then multiply the whole thing by x. Now you have to plug in 1 over x times t to the k minus 1 if you have k colors, and multiply by x to the k, t to the k, choose 2. So it's slightly more complicated substitution, but it's just a substitution of the weights from the white faces. And you can write down what locally the weights look like. Maybe it'll be clearer to see in an example. So just as before, we're gonna, for a single row, we're always gonna force a path to exit at the right. We're gonna assign tuples of partition now to as the boundary conditions. So the blue boundary condition on the bottom is 3, 1, 1, and the red boundary condition is 2, 1, 0. and tuples of partitions as a boundary condition at the top. And there's a little bit of technical details in that you have to shift the content line over. And if you do this, the weight will only be non-zero if mu and lambda interlace, and mu is the bigger partition. And by the tuples of partitions interlacing, I mean each of the individual partitions interlace. And you can work out what the weight of a single row will be. It'll be x to the difference in sizes times some interaction between the colors, and then some terms, some like factors that only depend on the number of paths. So these will be the factors we keep, and in the end, we'll just kind of, these won't depend on the configuration, it'll just depend on the rank, and we'll just ignore them. So the important bit is that we get the same thing we were getting for the like one color Aztec diamond for each color, plus some interaction term that depends on T. Okay. We'll also want to generalize the purple faces. So here are the like one color weights for the purple faces. And for a K color face, we just take the product of the one color, like the weights of each color, except now for color A, you get an X times T to some power when you exit right. And that power is the number of colors that are greater than A that are also in the face and are vertical. So one can show that, like, just like we got the LLT polynomial from the white faces, you could get the conjugate LLT polynomial for the purple faces up to some factors of T. But yeah, so the moral of this is that, you know, we get this X to the different size of the partitions, and T is an interaction, and we have some interlacing condition on our tuples of partitions. Okay. All right. So now these still satisfy the Yang-Baxter equation, but now the weights are more complicated because we have K colors. And for color A, when a path is going down and right, which was the important bit before, now instead of getting a 1 over 1 plus xy, we're going to get a 1 over 1 plus xy times T to the number of larger colors that are present, which for us will be all of them. So it'll just be T to the number of larger colors. So this is what's going to contribute to the partition function, this little bit here. So we take the same lattice, but now K colors. We have a sequence of interlacing tuples of partitions, which tell us how the paths cross at each horizontal slice. And in particular, each color satisfies the same interlacing condition we had for the Aztec diamond. So for each color, we can map it to a tiling of the Aztec diamond. And then we just have to see how the weights map. So that brings us to our K tilings. So it turns out if you work through how all the weights map from these colored paths to the tilings of the Aztec diamond, you get the same weights for the vertical dominoes. For every color, if there's a vertical domino like this, you get an X. And if there's a vertical domino like this, you get a Y. But now the interaction weight, where you get a power of T, comes from when you have a smaller color, which I've drawn in blue, and a larger color, which I've drawn in red, where they look like this. So you have one of these configurations. So our interaction becomes some local interaction on the dominoes. So yeah, for example, if we take these tuples of partitions, this corresponds to these tilings, where the first tuples, the first partition in each tuple gives us the blue, the second partition in each tuple gives us the red, and the third partition gives us the green. And we have the X and Y weights, which are, you can just get from each color individually, just counting vertical dominoes. And now we have these interaction weights. So for example, if we look at, say, this red domino, it's vertical with white on bottom and black on top. And it overlaps with this blue domino, which is vertical with white on bottom and red on top. So that gives us this case. So we get a factor of t from that. And if we count up all the interactions for this configuration, there ends up being 11, 4 between blue and red, 3 between blue and green, and 4 between red and green. So our vertex model gave us some local interaction between domino tilings. And now you can compute the partition function of this in the exact same way as before. And what you'll get is some overall factor only depends times the partition function of the Aztec diamond, which is given by this. So it's a nice generalization of the one color formula, right? If say if there was only one color, then we'd only have L equals 0, and we just get the product of 1 plus xi yj. But now we also product over the number of colors and have an extra t to the L. Okay. So the proof is exactly like in the one color case, except with the more complicated Yang-Baxter equation and a slightly more complicated vertex model. So I'm not going to go through it, but you start with this. You use the Yang-Baxter equation to swap all the rows, and you read off what the weights are. And as someone mentioned before, if you swap them completely, you can actually get a Cauchy identity for LLT polynomials using this argument. But if you stop where they alternate colors, you get this domino tiling. Okay, so now we're just gonna talk about the tilings. So now we've used the vertex model to give us a partition function. For the last, few minutes of our talk, we're just gonna study these tilings. So let's look at particular values of t. So when t is equal to 1, then all our Aztec diamonds are independent, and our partition function factors into k times the original Aztec diamond, as one would expect. But if t goes to 0, possibly surprisingly, what you get is, well, t is going to 0, so the only terms that aren't equal to 1 are those where L was equal to 0. And so you actually just pick up the partition function for a one color Aztec diamond. So we have that the partition function for the k color Aztec diamond at t is equal to 0 is equal to the partition function of the one color Aztec diamond. And we'd like to give a bijective proof of this. So we'll just give a mapping from domino tilings of k colors at t is equal to 0 to domino tilings of one color. And it turns out the easiest way to see this mapping is to look at Schroeder paths. So we need one more representation of our domino tilings. So we're going to assign a different kind of path. We're going to assign a path to every one of our dominoes now. So different from the vertex model paths, according to these rules. And if you see down here, we have all the domino tilings for rank 2, along with their corresponding Schroeder paths. Yeah. So one thing to note is these are non-intersecting. Okay. So if we translate our weights, our interaction weights, to the Schroeder paths picture, we see that whenever a smaller color is kind of intersecting a larger color, and the smaller color is coming from the top, that gives us a t. So when we take t to 0, we're going to disallow all of these. So that's going to put some restrictions on what our paths are allowed to do. And then we'll see how to map them to one color paths. So, like I said, we'll have some pretty strict restrictions on our Schroeder paths when we take t to 0. So if we just look at, we're going to do this all for 2 colors, but you could generalize it to k colors without much difficulty. So let's look at this top path here and ask, what can the paths do when they start? Well, If both the red and the blue path go up, then that's, this, and we get a power of t. But if, so that that's not allowed because t is going to go to 0. Now, if the blue goes up and the red goes over, well, eventually, since they end at the same point, eventually the blue will have to come back down and meet the red. And these give a power of t. So that is also not allowed. And what will end up happening is that the only thing the blue path can do at the start is go horizontally over one step. So this is like completely forced. This path is just frozen to do that when t goes to 0. And you can repeat this for the starting points of all the other paths. And for when m equals 4, when you're at rank 4, these are all frozen. Like they have no choice but to do this. Otherwise, they'd give an interaction and you get a t. And what you can do, so the way that bijection works out, is you take these frozen paths, you just delete them. So we've drawn a configuration, we've deleted everything that was forced by t going to 0. And now you just slide these paths down and they fit in nicely and you get a one color, like a one tiling of the Aztec diamond. So there's some details to be checked that this actually is a bijection, that this actually works. But it turns out you get this nice like sliding bijection from paths of k tilings to paths of a one tiling when t goes to 0. So I don't know, I thought this was rather cute. Great, so any questions about that?
Do you know what happens when you translate this to semi-standard Tableau?
I do not, I haven't checked. Yeah, I have no idea. Yeah, it'd be interesting to see what this means in terms of like the other formulations.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right, so now we're going to use this to compute the Arctic curve for the k tilings when t goes to 0. So just a brief description of the Arctic curve. So it's known that as we take the rank of the Aztec diamond to infinity, we'll end up with frozen regions of dominoes in the corners and a disordered region in the center, and that they are going to be separated by a deterministic curve known as the Arctic curve. And it's a theorem by Jokic, Prop, and Shor that, I'm paraphrasing. So modulo the right rescalings and shifting, so we're in the right diamond, that the Arctic curve is given by x squared plus y squared is equal to 1/2. So now we know a mapping from normal one tilings of the Aztec diamond to k tilings when t is equal to 0. Right, so we can just reverse our mapping of, say, this domino, like these domino tilings, to get domino tiling of or to get k tilings, and we can see what happens to the Arctic curve in that case. So if you follow this through, you end up with this kind of piecewise formula. This is for 2 tilings, but you can write it down for k tilings when t is equal to 0. So each of these regions of the Arctic curve, like the light blue, the pink, the green, and the black, correspond to, they map differently when you slide the paths. So you end up with different ellipses. They map each to a different ellipse. But you can write down the formula. And if you look at what the curve is, so here it is for 2 colors. And this is, where each chunk of the original Arctic curve mapped to. So in particular, each color has the same Arctic curve, and it's this weird egg shape. Okay. So there's one last special case I wanted to deal with, which was t goes to infinity. And it turns out there's actually like an involution between the tilings, where if you just reflect the tilings along the line y is equal to x, it maps a k tiling with j interactions to a k tiling with the maximum minus j. So this is just actually, if you like write out what happens to the local configurations under this reflection, you can check that this is true. It's just a careful checking of how the dominoes map under the reflection. And then you can use this to say that there's actually a bijection between configurations when t goes to 0 with the configurations as t goes to infinity. So the configurations with no interactions will map to the configurations with maximum interaction. In particular, the Arctic curve as t goes to infinity will be the same as t equals to 0 up to this reflection. But outside of like those special values, like t is equal to 1, t is equal to 0, and t goes to infinity, I can't really say much of anything about the model. I did some simulations, and you get these interesting looking limit shapes. So here's t is equal to 5, a rank 256 Aztec diamond, and a 2 tiling. And you see that we get, kind of some cusps forming down here, and it's still this strange egg looking shape, but I can't say anything precise at all. Yeah, so that's my talk. So in summary, so we can use the machinery from the LLT vertex model to construct coupled 5 vertex models, which we then use to construct coupled Aztec diamonds, tilings of the Aztec diamond. And in certain limits of the coupling parameter, we can say things. We have bijections between the k tilings and the 1 tilings. And we know the model has some symmetry with respect to t goes to 1 over t. But otherwise, I can't say much. It'd be interesting to understand, say, asymptotic behavior in the values outside of these special cases, and also just to see what tools from the normal Aztec diamond still carry over to the k tilings. Like, would the domino shuffle algorithm, is there a k tiling generalization that is still nice? Yeah, things like this I would be interested in, knowing the answers to. Thank you.
So I will stop the recording, and